Greetings, students, and welcome to our next lecture entitled An Introduction to Political Philosophy, Part 1. I'm Dr. T. Let's get started. All right, so in this lecture, we're basically going to be doing an overview of key terminology, questions, and ideas to set the foundation for understanding socio-political philosophy in the big picture, of course, of philosophical thought, but also as it relates to the early modern period, okay? That being said, by the time we're done with this particular lecture, you'll have a solid foundation in which to understand each of the key theories that we're going to be looking at in this particular unit. All right, so let's jump in. First things first, we need to understand what is political philosophy, right? In comparison to epistemology or other branches of philosophy. So, political philosophy is the philosophical study of essential questions related to things like political states, government systems, ideas of liberty and justice within a given society. Philosophical theories that we'll be covering this in this particular unit have focused on various questions such as ethics within a given society, individuals' rights, for example, a right to self-defense or the pursuit of happiness, and finally, the general well-being or the most effective functioning of a given state. Okay, all of these ideas essentially encompass the big picture of what it means to study political philosophy. Okay. So now, what are some key questions of political philosophy? We touched on these briefly when we talked about free will, because free will, again, branches or is a bridge between the ethical theory and socio-political theory, right? But now let's look at these in a little bit more depth, okay? So the questions of political philosophy are the following. What constitutes an ideal government structure, okay? What are the elements of an ideal system? This is an important question because it helps you in your everyday life evaluate whatever system you happen to be living in. Do you think that the government system in which you live under is the most sound and ideal government structure? If not, what things would you change? How would you change them? Okay. And also, in relation to the end of this unit, your assignment, part of your discussion, and your written reflection will actually be creating an ideal state. So you're going to learn these different philosophical theories, see how they basically shape their version of an ideal political state. But then you're going to be doing your own critical thinking, and I'm going to walk you through a step by step guide of how to essentially set up your own ideal society, your own utopia, if you will, which there's no actual state that's a utopia. But in this particular case, you're going to get as close as you could to an ideal state that you believe would be most efficient and the best functioning for the people. Okay. And again, this will be part of your written assignment as well as your discussion, but we'll get there later in the unit, okay? Now, other questions of political philosophy. Is government oversight even necessary? Do we need a government system at all? And if so, to what extent? Okay, what things should they regulate? What things should they have a hand in, etc.? Other questions. What duty does the government have to the people? And in turn, what obligation do the people have to the government, if any at all? Okay. Do we owe our government structure or our system to be patriotic or to follow blindly? Does the government owe the people certain things, certain freedoms, certain rights, certain basic needs being met? These are the kind of questions political philosophers have looked at, okay? Final two questions. What freedoms and rights are available within a given state? What rights should people have? What freedom should they have? What freedom should be limited? Having freedom over certain things might be problematic, right? I know in American culture, guns are a big thing. The freedom to own a gun, have a gun. But from another cultural perspective, that might actually be a freedom that's silly or very problematic, right? So we're going to look at and evaluate what do you think are essential freedoms within a given state. And finally, if and when, basically, can a government system be overthrown? Should a system be set up so that you can overthrow the government, or is that problematic to have that worked into a system? Should the people be able to throw out a government that's corrupt? Or do you think that at the end of the day, that breaks down the entire system? Okay, these are the kind of questions we're going to be looking at throughout this particular unit. So we're going to start with the early modern thinkers to set the foundation because that's what this course is about. But out of their ideas, there grew several other ideas, thoughts, different philosophical perspectives within the political realm. Okay. But to set the foundation, we're going to start with Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. Okay. Locke, many of his ideas are reflected in modern day libertarianism. Okay. Hobbes, he basically promoted a monarchy state, which we can see if we look across countries and states, okay, in some places, or something similar to it. And Rousseau basically pushed his idea of direct democracy, which we don't see very often, right? Democracy itself, there's some places that claim to be democratic, America being one of them, but direct democracy, true democracy, is a rare thing, okay? Now, what's some key terminology that you'll need to understand these big ideas presented by these philosophers? First thing you'll need to know is the social contract, okay? Each and every one of these philosophers set up what they called a social contract, okay? Which is essentially the idea that the people and the government must work together in order to maintain social order. It's a contract between the higher ups and the everyday people to make things function within a society. Now, that being said, different philosophers have suggested different variations of what a social contract should entail, right? Some have given more power to the people in their version of a social contract, whereas others have given more power to the state within a social contract. But the overall picture is how do the two components work together for an ideal state, okay? Natural rights. Natural rights are those rights that are believed absolutely necessary for all people. You can think of them today almost as human rights, okay? And these are things that are granted automatically upon birth to every single human being, okay? And it's also natural rights holds the idea that these are things that should not be taken away from people by another individual in society, but also not by the government themselves, right? One example of this is the right to life. Across all the philosophers we're covering, Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, they all hold the right to life as pretty essential. However, there's variations between philosophers too, okay? Different thinkers have argued for different natural rights. Some just think only the right to life, but then others have added more to natural rights or things they think people should inherently have, okay, within a given society. And most philosophers' view on natural rights often correlate with the type of government structure that they felt was both efficient and effective. All right. So now liberalism. All right. Liberalism basically grew out of or was influenced or has some connection to the work of Locke and Rousseau. More specifically, Locke. Okay. Liberalism is based off the principle of freedom, equality, individualism, and power from the bottom up. It's essentially the notion of power to the people, or in this case, power from the people, okay? Liberal systems essentially put a big emphasis on the people and their consent, and minimum emphasis on the government's power in structuring things or governing the people, okay? Now, there's different forms of liberalism. However, the basic notion is that liberal systems basically hold liberal ideas of freedom and are flexible and can change with the people's wills. And like I said, are people focused versus government focused. All right. The extreme of liberalism is the notion of anarchism. Okay. This is the most extreme form of liberalism, which totally rejects the government in total, right? So whereas some liberal thinkers may think the government should have a limited hand, the anarchist thinks no, the government shouldn't have any hand whatsoever. It feels the government is unnecessary, but also that the government is actually more harmful to the people than good. Okay. So this is just one potential perspective to look at a lens in which to look at a society through. Next is totalitarianism, okay? This is basically a state or ideology that promotes total authority, right? The government or authority has almost total control over every aspect of the state, and this includes the people, all right? In a totalitarian state, it's typically led by a dictator. The freedom of the people is limited, And it's usually intolerant of change to the status quo. So you can see these are the two extremes, right? You have the liberal perspective over here, and if you take it to the furthest extreme, you have the anarchy state with absolutely no government overseeing. And then this side of things with totalitarianism, you basically have the other extreme of the government plays a big role and the people basically follow the government's lead, okay? Their voice doesn't necessarily matter in this type of system, okay? Now we'll see in Hobbesian political thought, we'll see this idea kind of come forth, okay? And we'll again, like libertarianism, talk about this a little further in more detail later in the unit, all right? So let's go all the way back, okay? I talked about the thinkers we're going to be focused on mostly, although we're looking back, then we're going to focus in on the early modern period, then we're going to look ahead a little bit at some contemporary thinkers within the political, socio-political realm, okay? But let's go all the way back to Plato, okay, who essentially first set the foundation for the idea that the people or members of a society must agree or make some kind of resolution with the government, okay? Now, in Plato's view, he was very much against democracy, okay? He actually argued that by being within a society and benefiting from the society, that you're implicitly agreeing to follow the order of said society, okay? So basically, it's the idea that if I grew up here in the States, I've benefited in some ways, right? I've had access to public education, to different parts of society at the end of the day, culture, etc. And based off of that, my staying is my implicit or unspoken agreement to basically follow said society. All right. So, according to Plato, he believed that you must do what those in leadership asked. Okay. And basically, it was his belief that those that make the law are most knowledgeable about the law. So hence, we should follow the law of the land in which we are in and in which we are benefiting from. He was basically, you've probably heard people say this before, and it's not that you don't have to agree or disagree, but this was his particular view. He was basically of the camp, if you don't like it, then you leave, okay? Thus ending your unspoken contract with the state. But essentially, he was not explicitly advocating for totalitarianism, but he did believe in the power of the state over the power of the people because he essentially believed that the people's view could not essentially be trusted, which is why he did not like the idea of democracy. And we see this in his works, his written works on Credo. If you were to ever take time, again, another suggested work for the future, I'll make a list of all these different suggestions that I've made throughout these different lectures in case you just want to do extra reading and learning in relation to all of these topics we've covered. Okay, but again, Plato set the stage for the thinkers to come that we're covering in the early modern period, and then these early modern thinkers that we're looking at, Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke, essentially set a foundation for future thinkers such as Rawls, who we'll cover later this unit, and then just bigger ideas and questions that we'll be looking at, okay? Now, understanding the state of nature is so essential, okay? The state of nature was the starting point for almost all early modern political thought, okay? Like every single philosopher we're covering, and even contemporary social contract theorists have used some version of a state of nature, okay? The state of nature is essentially a hypothetical or imagined state of how people would function before government or without the structure of traditional society. How are people in their natural state? Hence the state of nature, okay? And this starting point, basically, depending on one's perspective, was a guide in how each philosopher set up their notion of an ideal government or social contract, okay? So the state of nature was kind of the initial building block for each political theory and social contract, because again, how they viewed people before government essentially guided the type of government that you would need in order to be most efficient for the people as you perceive them within the state of nature. Okay. So that's why this idea it's probably the most important idea from all of the ideas and terminology that we're covering. All right. anti-social contract. So many thinkers at this time, the ones we're covering, I mean, even the ones we're not, were fans of this notion of a social contract. Again, there has to be this agreement between um, the people and the state, okay? Now, there were some philosophers, though, of this time that were against the idea. Not very many, but there were some. One was David Hume, who we've previously covered, right? Hume specifically argued that an individual can't or should not be bound into an agreement that's set by their ancestors. If we think of the American Constitution, which has been around for hundreds of years, right? It would essentially be the idea that people today shouldn't be functioning off of a document from hundreds of years ago because it technically is an agreement that was set at a different time with different people and different needs, etc. Okay, so we shouldn't be bound to those same agreements. There's some people that would agree with that, and of course, there's very many people that would. There's people that would not agree with that, and just basically says the especially specifically the Constitution should hold no matter what it holds through time. It's a matter of perspective. Okay. Now, Hume also questioned the validity of this whole state of nature. Although it's essential to political theories from this time, he basically argued that because it's hypothetical, it's thus not wholly accurate, so it doesn't necessarily truly represent how things actually are or would be. It's basically your presumption of how you think things would be, and you're setting up an ideal state from a presumption versus actual fact, okay? So this was where we saw some pushback to the social contract from individuals like Hume to Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes. Okay. Now you have the basics. Okay. You have the groundwork, the terminology, some of the ideas, and kind of a general direction in where we're going. But what are your initial thoughts when you hear all of this, when you start thinking in a socio-political, philosophical sense, right? What comes to mind? How do you think power should be split between the government and the people? Do you think it should be 60-40, 50-50, 90-10, or 100% one way or the other? What freedoms or rights do you think are inherent to human beings? Would you say only the right to life? Would you say the right to vote, the right to have children, all sorts of things? You can kind of decide for yourself what freedoms and rights you think are essential to humans. And what do you think people would be like in a state of nature? You're going to hear different perspectives, but if we took away government tomorrow or we imagined a time before government, what do you think people would be like without government oversight? Do you think we would function well together? Or do you think it would be chaotic or somewhere in between? And why? Okay. This is basically your food for thought as we move into the next lecture. So take some time with those questions, start to think about them, let them kind of brew in your brain, and then you'll get to see who you most align with when you hear the different philosophical theories. All right. That being said, we're at the end of the lecture. So, as usual, thank you so much for your time. And please continue on. I'll see you in the next lecture. All right. Take care.